Hello and welcome to episode 348 of AvTalk. I am Ian Pechnick, joined for the first time ever by
Daniel Gustafsson.
Daniel, welcome to not only AvTalk, welcome to Flight Radar 24. We are in the Stockholm office this week. Jason is currently traversing Japan. Last we checked in with him, he was riding a lot of trains and at a cat cafe. So not conducive to recording a podcast this week. So Daniel, who has recently joined Flight Radar 24 on the content and communications team with me, is filling in for this episode. So Daniel, welcome.
Thank you so much. It's an honor. I feel like a lightweight Jason somehow. Also, I want to add that it sounds terrible to be in Japan. I'd much rather be here.
Yeah, of course, in the beautiful Stockholm
Yes, who needs
weather.
good food and cat cafes and bullet trains?
Nobody.
That's right.
Daniel, tell us a little bit about your background, where you are coming from and how you made your way to Flight Radar 24.
Right. So to make a really complicated long story very short or reasonably short, I started out as a journalist and then I ventured into PR. I became essentially a PR monkey. And then I had a midlife crisis and I decided to be a pilot. So I became a pilot. And I worked as an airline pilot for a couple of years. And since the pandemic, which affected me along with a lot of other folks, of course, I've been basically switching back and forth between aviation and marketing. So that's basically it.
And now you can do both.
Now I can do both.
Well, welcome. We've got a good show today. Lots to get through. Some things that we haven't been able to get to over the past few weeks because we've been busy for various reasons. So we're going to get through some of the not necessarily new, but some ongoing news. And then we'll get to some new stuff as well. So we're going to dive in with the situation in Venezuela first. A few weeks ago, the U.S. Federal Aviation Administration issued a security NOTAM that said operators should avoid Venezuelan airspace. This is not hugely affecting U.S. traffic necessarily because most U.S. operators were already avoiding Venezuelan airspace. There were a few cargo carriers that passed through Venezuelan airspace, but not a huge amount of traffic. And also, prior to this, U.S. airlines couldn't fly to or from Venezuela anyway since 2019. So this is not necessarily directly impacting U.S. airlines, but the military buildup in the region has affected the other airlines that are operating to Venezuela. And so that led to both Portugal and Spain issuing NOTAMs, and then recently on the 1st of December, re-upping those NOTAMs for an extended period of time. So Portugal's has been extended through the 10th of December, and Spain is all the way through the end of the month. And Spain recommends that their operators not fly through or to Venezuela, quote, due to the potential risk to civil aviation from increased military activity, anti-aircraft weapons capable at all altitudes, and this is the important part here, lack of coordination between the parties to the conflict. The U.S. NOTAM lists potential risks because of military activity, military drills, and GPS jamming. But I think Spain hits the nail on the head here, where they say between parties to the conflict, or lack of coordination between the parties to the conflict.
Yeah, they're basically the adults in the room.
Yeah.
That's my takeaway here.
Exactly. And so the other day, or over the weekend, President Trump posted on social media that Venezuelan airspace should be considered closed. That's not how it works. And also, no one really listened as far as outside of European carriers. No one really listened to that, but because of the lack of coordination between the parties to the conflict. Most flights that are operating to or from Venezuela in the region have continued to operate. And Colombia's Civil Aviation Authority has actually gone out of its way to say, it's fine. We're still going. Here's some photos from a bunch of different aircraft showing us flying over Venezuela. So I thought that was a very interesting tact to take to demonstrate the safety. That's not to say that this won't escalate and Venezuelan airspace could be closed. But at the moment, flights are just traversing around Venezuela. That's been the major impact. So flights that were flying from countries west of Venezuela to countries east of Venezuela, still in South America, they have now gone out of their way, basically adding 600 miles to their flights. So another situation where we have a conflict zone rerouting flights. It's an ongoing situation that will continue to follow, but at the moment, it seems that no news is good news.
Right. It's good news for jet fuel providers, basically.
Sure. Yeah. Jet fuel providers and aircraft dispatchers who really like to find alternate routes. Let's move on to a story that was published in Flying Magazine this week that I found very interesting, bringing new light to the behind-the-scenes conflict between the U.S. National Transportation Safety Board and India's Air Accident Investigation Branch. This stems from the investigation into Air India Flight 171 that crashed shortly after takeoff. The Wall Street Journal first reported this late last week, that the NTSB and Indian investigators disagreed on where to examine the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder after they were recovered. Apparently, the Indian investigators wanted to examine those in a lab in northern India in the town of Korwa. The NTSB wanted the black boxes to be taken to either New Delhi or flown all the way to the NTSB lab in Washington, D.C. They were reluctant to send their personnel to the region and went so far as NTSB Chair Jennifer Hamidi blocked NTSB investigators in Delhi using U.S. State Department employees, telling them, do not go to Korwa. So she issued an ultimatum that said, we're done with this investigation. We're pulling out. We're not going to be part of the investigation unless you choose New Delhi or fly the boxes to Washington so that we can use our lab.
Yeah.
They ended up choosing New Delhi. The interesting thing here is that there was some concern about the 787. Was this issue related specifically to the aircraft? Because if it is, you're going to end up with a fleet-wide problem. We'll talk about it with the Airbus A320 family in just a moment. So the standoff here about how they were sharing information and when they would produce the flight recorder readout to be able to make a determination is a safety recommendation necessary to all operators of the 787. So I thought that was a very interesting detail to see in a bit of the behind the scenes of the investigation. I mean, at the moment, what we know now is what the preliminary report says, and that's not much. The preliminary report says that the fuel control switches on the 787 were moved from run to cutoff. There's a bit of dialogue that got posted in the preliminary report, but there are gaping holes and a lot of unanswered questions. Yeah. So knowing what we know now from this back and forth between the NTSB and the Indian AAIB, it doesn't provide me with a lot of confidence that we're going to understand what actually caused this crash.
No, not really. It's a strange case. This whole thing is just, I don't know. Is it a clash of cultures, this whole thing, that the U.S. and the Indian investigators don't get along that well? Or is it a matter of national pride? Or
I think there might be some national pride at stake here, but I also think it is a sense of who is to, not that accident investigations are designed to apportion blame, because they're specifically designed not to do that.
Exactly.
But I think that any cause that leads to blame for something, I think that there is concern there. Whereas the NTSB is saying, look, we don't care what's going on. We want to know whether or not something happened that could affect the thousands of other planes that are still flying.
Which makes sense.
So I think this is one where we'll eventually get a final report. And unfortunately, I think it'll be lacking in certain areas if the preliminary report is to be any guide. Let's switch to Airbus, because over the past week or so, operators of Airbus A320 family aircraft have been scrambling to downgrade software or replace hardware in the elevator aileron computers on those aircraft. More than 6,000 possible aircraft were affected, and this came out of a message from Airbus to all operators that had a specific piece of hardware operating a specific version of the software. Because of a JetBlue incident that occurred at the end of October, where the aircraft experienced an uncommanded descent. That was traced back to the ELAC computer, which was corrupted by intense radiation. It was found that a particular version of the software didn't have the necessary checks to make sure that the computer wasn't corrupted there. So the solution was relatively simple, just roll back the software. So thankfully, based on the initial information compared to what we know now, the effects were much less than were initially, because I mean, when you think about how many Airbus A320 family aircraft are
a few
in the air,
a few,
yeah, exactly, 6,000 possible affected aircraft. I mean, we track at any given moment, we're tracking 34 to 3,500, sometimes upward of 4,000 A320 family aircraft at the same time. So that's a lot of planes. I actually flew on an A320neo on Sunday, and SAS had in the app this big red banner, which I thought was an interesting choice, saying that everything was okay.
Right.
They later updated it to a blue banner, which
good,
I thought was a much better choice for that. But it was interesting to see how different airlines handled that. A lot of airlines were able to downgrade, basically, their affected aircraft relatively quickly. Unfortunately, it seems that the precipitating event on JetBlue is the airline that took the longest to update everything. And of course, this happened over the extremely busy Thanksgiving weekend, where record numbers of travelers were flying in the US. And so it was just not a great week for JetBlue.
Bad timing overall.
Yeah, really bad timing. But things seem better now, and I assume that with this downgrade, Airbus will then come out with another software update so that they can address those issues with the computer. So we'll keep an eye on this, and we can post the emergency airworthiness directive that came out from EASA and then the subsequent directive from the FAA as well in the show notes, just so you can, if you really want to read about the ELAC, you can do that. Let's look at another incident that we received a preliminary report on yesterday. This was a Ryanair 737-8-200 MAX, so the special high-density version of the MAX that Ryanair flies. This was a preliminary report from Spanish investigators about an incident that happened in Malaga, where Ryanair Flight 8506 was experiencing foul weather on approach to Malaga. They began a go-around, and then as part of the go-around, apparently descended to just about 1,000 feet and experienced a ground proximity warning and were able to pull up. They also experienced an overspeed event going over 300 knots on the indicated airspeed. So not a good situation. But Daniel, you were, as kind of putting on your pilot hat for a moment, you were telling me kind of the experience here that you might have gone into this.
Right. So a bunch of things came to mind. One thing that came to mind is that going from 1,000 feet roughly to 2,000 feet, so basically climbing 1,000 feet, it may sound like a lot, but you don't really have that much time. And also if you perform a go-around, you get a certain level of oomph from those engines when you press the toga button. So basically what I'm trying to say is that this happens really fast. And there's like a startle effect to it to a certain extent as well. So although I have no idea, and I don't think it's my place to say what happened in there, I have a theory what happened, basically. So they go around, they get up to 2,000 feet really fast. And 2,000 feet, it's a pretty low altitude for a go-around, typically, at least in Europe. They get there. They're also supposed to...
You're saying the target altitude was 2,000?
Yes, it's 2,000. And so 1,000 feet happens really fast. They're also supposed to turn on the go-around. So I think they kind of get startled by that, and they commence to turn to the left. When doing this, a bit startled, push the yoke forward, and they start to dive. The thing that doesn't make sense to me is that the dive is a pretty sharp dive. It's like 3,000 to 4,000 feet a minute.
Exactly.
Which is, it's not like a subtle dive. You can feel that.
Yeah.
So they dive for about 1,000 feet and then pull up, bleed off the airspeed, and then they basically get vectors and land successfully. But it sure raises quite a few questions what happened there.
Yeah, and we received the preliminary report from Spanish investigators in 2 weeks. I mean, which is, half the time it usually takes. Granted, not a ton of information there, but it'll be interesting to see whether or not the weather played a role here. We know that the weather played a role in the go-around, in why a go-around happened, but not necessarily if weather was a factor in the dive back towards the water. But thankfully, they were able to go around, stabilize the aircraft, and come back and land.
Yeah.
Similarly, we have Air Arabia that took off from Catania on a maintenance positioning flight and came within 41 feet of the sea not long after takeoff. It's not great.
It's not great. Yeah. 1,000 feet above the sea is better than 41 feet, for sure.
They also experienced a ground proximity warning system. Investigators are focusing on the lack or possible lack of takeoff performance calculations inputted into the aircraft's computer.
Yeah. And for me as a Boeing pilot, what strikes me here as very strange is that I have this mythical view of the Airbus as being an aircraft that is virtually impossible it will always save the day somehow. So it's weird to me that you can not program it correctly, or even in fact just not input data into it, and it will still allow you to take off using that non-existent data. That is, to me, that is a bit strange.
Yeah. So it's interesting here with the report notes that a lot of the safety functions and features that would normally prevent certain things from happening were not engaged because of the lack of data. So the speed reference system, which would maintain the speed through the pitch control in the initial climb, would normally have been engaged, but they didn't enter any V2 reference speed.
Right.
So the aircraft had no idea what it was supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
The report says that in the aircraft's configuration, the way the aircraft was configured, takeoff rotation would have been at 131 knots and V2 climb speed of 133 knots. In fact, because they started a flex takeoff and then hit the toga buttons, they reached 144 knots before they rotated, and they lifted off at 157 knots. So no side stick input was applied during the takeoff roll, but the nose gear twice lifted off the runway before the entire aircraft took off. After the aircraft reached 123 feet above the ground, so this is radio altimeter height, the captain began putting nose down pitch inputs.
Yeah.
Very, very strange stuff.
Very odd.
But the climb was stopped at 383 feet, and then a descent began. The autopilot was briefly engaged, but they continued to operate the side stick and change autopilot settings and change thrust settings. Then they started to get all those nasty warnings. Sink rate, pull up from the ground proximity warning system. From there, they were able to climb, they were able to control the aircraft, and they were able to continue the flight. This is not a final report, so it'll be very interesting to see what they conclude. But investigators say they are looking into other things like somatogravic illusion and possible human aircraft interface issues, as well as communication issues between the crew. So just a very strange set of circumstances, but one that we've seen before.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, perhaps we'll see again. Let's move through kind of some of the more fun things,
right,
I guess, although a couple of these aren't so fun. But Airbus has said they are coming along with the A350 freighter, which I'm super excited about, mostly just to see that livery painted on an actual aircraft for the first time. I think that's going to be a lot of fun. But Airbus now announcing that they are about to fit the giant cargo door to the fuselage. So the fuselage has been rolled out. It is in Toulouse, but they still have yet to fit the cargo door. So we're going to see that upcoming, and I'm really looking forward to that. We've done some things with that cargo door. When Chris Lomas was at the Paris Air Show last year. He was able to go through the basically A350 cargo loading simulator. So we have an interesting video that we'll link to in the show notes to have a look at that. Some very interesting stuff to see what you can fit in the A350 freighter, including a whole engine. You don't need to take apart the Trent engine to fit it into the A350 freighter. So
that's convenient.
Yeah, exactly. Be interesting to see. Norse couldn't turn a full profit for the year because of softening transatlantic demand. That's according to their latest financial reports. However, they do say that their dual track strategy of flying high density, high profitability tattle routes with leasing all of their other planes to Indigo is starting to bear fruit. I mean, I think this is a really interesting trying to figure out what works and what doesn't.
Yeah, basically learning as you go for Norse, who have, I mean, it's no secret they've been struggling for, is it 4 years they've been flying, I think. It's been a constant struggle. I really, really hope that it works out well. I think there's a market for low-cost long haul, but as we can tell, it's one battle after another.
Yeah, they say that they're getting rid of 7 transatlantic destinations that had, quote, below average pricing. And they're going to keep 7 with the above average pricing. So we'll see how those shake out. And they're also adding capacity on winter routes to Asia, as is nearly every other airline.
Yes.
So that'll be interesting to see how they can compete there. But they seem to be doing quite well. So hopefully between that and they're flying for Indigo, then they'll continue to do well. When they first started flying, we had a good chat with their president about their ideas for moving forward. He's since left the airline, but it seems like they've done well with some of those things that he mentioned, but also, the same challenges as other long-haul, low-cost airlines before them.
Yeah. One may ask themselves if this ACMI thing is their future, period, and not flying under their own brand name for consumers. We'll see.
Does Norse become high fly?
Exactly, basically. Or an Indigo subsidiary. We'll
Right.
see. Yeah, we can for sure say that this Indigo deal has saved them for now, for sure.
Speaking of high fly, we can talk about them real quickly
Yes.
and say that they have been the first airline to operate the A330 to Antarctica. Previously, they had only used the A340 for their flights with White Desert. That was the trip that Gabe did last December. And so we've got a whole bunch of great videos from Antarctica on that. But now they can use the A330. They say that they can use the A330 now because of additional ground handling equipment that is available in Antarctica for the first time. So instead of having to operate the A340 and basically keep one of the engines running while it sits on the ground for a couple hours, they can turn that off and then not have any issues restarting, the engines to get back in the air. So it saves fuel, obviously, because you only have 2 engines on the A330, but it also saves fuel on the ground and is a bit more environmentally friendly. So good for them.
Good for them, and also to return to my previous point earlier, it's bad news for aviation fuel companies.
Yeah,
so the Venezuela thing,
it.
It basically balances out, I think.
We're balancing it out.
Yeah, so don't buy any stocks based on this. That is my main takeaway here.
And we're going to mention New Zealand to end the episode. I feel like we don't talk about New Zealand terribly much, except when they come out with new, Skybed products and Skybunks and all of those things. So we're still waiting for that. But in this case, we're actually talking about the New Zealand Air Force because they have finally selected the A321 XLR to replace their aging 757s that have become a bit of a joke. We're stranding politicians in certain places, needing a lift home and things like that. So just another domino falling against the 757 and into the A321 XLR bucket.
Yes. I like the 757.
Who doesn't? I mean, that's the thing about all of this is it's been such a great aircraft, is such a great aircraft. It's fun to fly. It's, just a fantastic all-around experience, but they're old.
Yes. And so are we.
And so are we. Well, on that note, we're going to go continue to enjoy beautiful Stockholm, gray, not quite rainy, but threateningly so.
This is a great advertisement for Stockholm.
Exactly, especially at the beginning of December. It really is beautiful. You should come. Jason's, who knows what Jason's doing, but
Having a terrible time.
yeah, having a
Let's
terrible
just
time.
assume that he's having a terrible time.
That's the only way we can get through. But Daniel, I want to say thank you so much for stepping in this week and joining the podcast, and we will certainly be hearing more from you in the future. I am Ian Petchnick, here for the first time with
Daniel Gustafsson. Thanks
Thank
for
you so
having
much
me.
for listening.